Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Amy Sam. I am the Health Education Project Specialist at the Maxwell and Eleanor Blum Patient Family Learning Center at Mass General. Today's event is part of our Migration is Beautiful campaign, a special collaboration between the MGH Center for Immigrant Health, MGH Office of Belonging and Engagement, and the Blum Center. Before we get started, I just want to go a few items with you all. Please note that today's session is being recorded for educational purposes. If you're interested in viewing the recording, it'll be made available on the Blum Center website at massgeneral.org/Blum-Center. Please note that you're in listen-only mode. Everyone has music and hear a guest speaker today. If you have any questions or comments you'd like to share, feel free to do so in the chat, which is located at the bottom of your screen. We'll have time for them in the end. Only Blum Center staff, our co-hosts, and guest speakers will see your questions. Please do not share any personal medical information or questions in the chat. If you have a personal medical question, please ask your doctor. Lastly, at the end of today's session, you'll be directed to a brief survey, which we'd like to ask you to help us complete. Your feedback is important to us as we plan future programs. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Fiona Danaher. She is the director of the MGH Center for Immigrant Health, and she has a few words to share with you all.
Hi, thank you so much, Amy, and thank you everybody for joining us. We are very excited to be celebrating Migration is Beautiful this week and appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with the Blum Center on today's event. The MGH Center for Immigrant Health, for a little bit of background, grew from the work of the MGH Immigrant Health Coalition, which is a network of MGB employees that was established in 2018 to advance health and social equity for immigrants. The Center for Immigrant Health launched in 2020 to serve as a formal hub for fostering excellence in clinical care, education, advocacy, and research to improve the health and well-being of immigrants across all of Mass General Hospital and within the broader community. As part of that mission, we're excited to host MGH's 7th annual Migration is Beautiful campaign in honor of the United Nations International Migrants Day, which falls on December 18th each year. Migration is Beautiful seeks to celebrate and raise awareness about the cultural richness and resilience brought by people who migrate. To that end, we're thrilled to welcome today's speaker, who Natalie Johnson will introduce.
Thank you so much, Fiona, for that welcome. My name is Natalie Johnson. I'm the Administrative Director for MGH's Office of Belonging and Engagement, also referred to as OBE. In alignment with the mission of the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, OBE is committed to elevating the perspectives of the communities we serve with humility and respect through an inclusive lens. One of OBE's shared values is to promote continuous learning through support and provision of opportunities for education, open dialogue, and growth. Today's conversation is a perfect example of our work, and now it's my pleasure to introduce former classmate and now colleague, Chanda Ouk Wolf. Chanda Ouk Wolf writes and speaks about the Cambodian diaspora in America. She is an experienced higher education professional, and her passion for uplifting the voices of immigrants and refugees through children's literature stems from her own lived experience. As the daughter of genocide survivors, she advocates for breaking the silence about the unspeakable truths of Cambodia's killing fields. Chanda lives in Boston, Massachusetts, and invites you to visit her at her website, chandaukwolf.com, or on Instagram at unspeakable.truth.by.c.ouk-wolf. Welcome, Chanda.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And just quickly, I would like to thank MGH Center for Immigrant Health for having me here today. And I'd also quickly like to thank several people who made this event possible and working closely with me to ensure that belonging is part of MGH community. Natalie Johnson, Amy, Sam, Rahil Samuel Balsam, Fiona Danaher, Hannah Biskine, Kara Huddleston, and Isabel Lana. So thank you so much for making this event possible. I think I'll just move quickly into the reading itself. And we will go from there. So this is my new book. Let me just see if I can do this. This is, maybe it's not going as planned. I apologize. I think I just need to change my settings quickly, just so you have a chance to actually see the book. Okay. I think I have this now. Can folks see this book? Is that a better view? Okay, so now that I have the book visible, I think I will just begin reading so you have a chance to hear the story fully. So this is called A Dozen Delicious Donuts, a Sweet Cambodian-American Story, written by Chanda Ouk Wolf and illustrated by Julia Yinling. So here, I'll just kind of do the pages maybe on this side. You can kind of see the illustrations here. The best way to do this is probably like this. This here. Can you see that? I hope everyone can see that. It's a little bit difficult to share, but hopefully you'll be able to see the images. I'm Pip, an 8-year-old Cambodian-American girl. I was born in the United States after my parents made a long and difficult journey from Phnom Penh, Cambodia to Los Angeles, California. As you can see, Cambodia is a long way from Los Angeles, California. Everyone in my family, including my 3 sisters, loves donuts. On Saturdays, Mama buys them and brings them home in a bright pink box. Did you know there are more than 1,000 Cambodian-owned donut shops in Southern California? Mama asks as she unboxes the donuts. Knowing this gives me a good idea. Yesterday at school, my teacher announced the annual baking contest. The bake-off would take place in a week. Get ready, she said. Your homework is to let me know what you will be sharing at the bake-off. So here is what I'll bake. Donuts, homemade from the recipe Grandma brought from Cambodia. Before Grandma found a new home in America, she made donuts with her grandmother. Sometimes they made so many they would share with the entire village. When Grandma left Cambodia, she brought very few things. No dresses or shoes, except what she was wearing. What she did bring was the donut recipe, tucked away in a secret pocket sewn on the inside of her blouse. Whenever Grandma and I make donuts together, she makes sure we have all of the ingredients and we follow the directions carefully. Otherwise, the donuts will not be perfect. Here we are with the sweet rice flour, sugar, salt, and coconut milk all mixed together in a large bowl. After the donuts cooked, Grandma helps me put on the toppings. She smiles and says, "Perfect, my darling Gonchao." Oh, look at that stick. The day of the bake-off arrives. I walk through the doors of the school gym. A sugary smell fills my nose. Banners, muffin platters, cake stands, cupcake towers, and cookie trays line the room. I carry my donuts to my table, a dozen donuts all together. As I set them down, the donuts nearly topple over. I look around and I see all kinds of baked goods. I gaze at my 12 donuts glazed with caramelized palm sugar, sprinkled with toasted sesame seeds. I think lots of competition. I will never win. Then I nervously place a sign in front of my table with the Khmer word for donuts, Nongong. I overhear some comments. Weird, yuck, totally odd. Different. The judge makes an announcement. This year, the baking contest will be judged by the contestants. Each contestant will visit every table and fill out a scorecard. The baked goods will be rated based on taste, texture, and originality. Good luck to all. My heart thumps. Ba-boom, ba-boom. I slump my shoulders. The odds are against me. The first to show up to my table is a girl with freckles and bright red hair. As she takes a bite, her eyes widen. Wow. Next comes a boy with big blue eyes and 2 missing teeth. After a nibble, he grins from ear to ear. Scrumptious. Then another girl stops by with a turned up nose and thick silky braids. She gives it a munch and whoops, delicious. Shortly after that, a boy with furry eyebrows and small ears approaches. He chews rather slowly, then shouts, not like any donut I've ever tasted. Time's up, says the judge, and he instructs everyone to return to their tables. Everyone votes, and there's a tie between the raspberry cinnamon rugula and my glazed sesame donuts. The judge says last year's winner will cast the tie-breaking vote. Wait, shouts the rugula maker. The trophy should go to because her nongong are crisp yet chewy, airy and light, and they are fresh and sweet smelling, completely irresistible and the most original. The others whistle, cheer, and clap. Much to my surprise, I leave with an empty donut tray and a prize. When Grandma visits, we fix our eyes on the shiny medal. The only thing better than winning first prize at the bake-off is sharing my award with Grandma. Matyeye say to Grandma in Khmer, the medal doesn't belong to me. This is for you, for holding on to traditions and teaching them to me. The end. And there's a bonus recipe here where you can make the donuts at home. And there's a did you know section where you can find out some of the words that are being used and understand the context for some of the symbols and icons associated with the book. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Chanda, for sharing the story with us. We invite any participants to share questions in the chat. And in the meantime, Chanda, I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit more on your thoughts about why people migrate.
Thanks, Fiona. I think there's a series of reasons, and I don't think there's any one particular reason, but for my family, it was political instability. And sometimes there's religious persecution. And sometimes it's just better opportunities, but almost all is for a better life.
And what do you think that we as individuals can do to help welcome people to this country?
I'm always pro small acts of kindness. And it's just, you know, sometimes realizing that, smiling and being more welcoming in the smallest of ways. And it seems silly, but, opening the door and holding it when someone is new or different to the country, even in the hospitals, you probably see it's small things like that. And, I think just warm and kind words and words of encouragement that, I think we all feel in some ways that we are connected more than we all realize. And so, again, I think just going back to small acts of kindness, and that's really a series of many things. There's no one particular way you can be warm and kind. So that's kind of my thought around that.
We have a couple of additional discussants here with us who I just want to introduce. Dr. Rahel Basan, who is the Associate Director for Psychiatry for the Center for Immigrant Health, and Hannah Biskind, who is the Mental Health Program Manager for the Center for Immigrant Health. And I would invite both of them, as well as you, Chanda, to share your thoughts on the next question, which is, what do you think are some of the mental health impacts of forced displacement? And how do they play out across generations?
Well, I can speak to my own experience. And my parents are both survivors of the genocide of the killing fields in Cambodia. And so it took 3 different countries before they actually arrived to America. And I think there's this idea that when you come, that it's like resources are available, and that everyone is lending a helping hand. And sometimes that isn't necessarily the first reaction to coming to America. And so I think when forced displacement happens, resources needs to be put into place. And I think of places like MGH having a Center for Immigrant Health and Refugees, and understanding that there's also psychological conditions that are associated with forced displacement. And so I would welcome, Hannah and Rahel to talk about some of the conditions that are associated with forced displacement.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chandra, and just really just wanted to say your book and love reading it with my kids. I'm also an immigrant myself and can relate to some of the stories there. And, I think to your point, I think forced displacement can have really profound psychological impact. I think not just on individuals, but also family systems and generationally as well. I think someone once said that forced displacement is not just a physical movement. It's really an emotional and mental shift, often tearing apart the fabric of one's inner world. And so we have to really recognize that nobody really wants to leave their home or country, unless, I think there's a poet that we often quote, at least I often quote hers. She's a Kenyan-born Somali poet, Worcestershire. She says, unless no one wants to leave home or country unless home becomes the mouth of a shark. And I think that really encapsulates, I think, the tremendous loss and suffering and trauma that come with forced displacement. It's a loss of home, it's safety, it's a loss of safety and family connections. And so I think at an individual level, folks that are forcibly displaced often face higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety compared to the general population. And studies have shown that actually about 30 to 40% of displaced individuals suffer from these conditions, often usually due to the violence, persecution, and really uncertainty of their journey. I think even at a family systems level, I think displacement often fragments relationships. Families are separated during migration, with some members maybe detained or lost or left behind. And this can, I think, strain relationships, erode, family structures, and sometimes force children to take on adult responsibilities, and translating or navigating new system. And this can also challenge traditional family roles and create additional stress, both for parents and children. And then I would say really at the generational level, I think trauma can leave imprints and can be passed from one generation to the next. Often it's described as like intergenerational transmission of stress or trauma. And so often, like, children of displaced individuals may face fear, anxiety, or depression, or identity conflicts, or challenges integrating into a new culture. And often these struggles are shaped and influenced by parents' unresolved fears or traumas and overwhelming stress. I actually remember, for me, like growing up, we kind of immigrated to Europe, and my mom had a lot of anxiety around government documents. And anytime there was some paperwork that had to be done, there was a tremendous anxiety. And once I grew up and moved to the States, and anytime I came as an international student, every time I had to renew my F1 or whatever, there was all this anxiety around it. And it's just a simple paperwork. And it took a while for me to recognize that, that was really passed on just from our own context of growing up and having that stress around those traumas with, like making sure that our status was okay in that country. So I think these kinds of emotional burdens that parents carry can sometimes influence their children's experiences, often creating these cycles of anxiety. But I think I also have to say, just listening to your story and your book, that there can also be generational resilience that can be passed on, and traditions that can be passed on. And I think there is tremendous strength that immigrant communities bring, and they pass on to their children and their families from generation to generation. I think your book really beautifully highlights that.
Thank you, Rahel, and thank you, Chanda, so much. And your book is such a beautiful story, illustration, and depiction of intergenerational passing of culture and sharing, right? And I think a lot when I think about folks who have suffered forced displacement or who have been forced to leave behind something that felt like home, somewhere that felt like home, people that felt like home. I think about Pauline Boss's concept of ambiguous loss. This idea, right, that there's a loss of something that's kind of still exists and it's kind of still there. And how does that exist in the memory? How do we love a place that also became so dangerous for us? How do we protect our next generation of children from that kind of danger? And how that can kind of seep into the different pieces. I think even Rahel is giving us some good examples of that. And I think about the way language is or isn't passed down. For some folks, they didn't want to teach their children their language because they didn't want their children to be bullied in school because of an accent or to be otherwise discriminated against. Or perhaps they aren't. I know my background is Jewish, and so we're also diasporic survivors of genocide. And, there's certain practices that we have now of survivors hoarding food, for example, because there's a fear, right, of not having enough. And what does that do to the kids that grow up with that? And how do we try to kind of make sense of this? And how do we pass along traditions? Like, I think in Judaism, so many of our rituals, like candlesticks, we can travel with them. Other candles, we can travel with them. And how do we, or do a Shabbat ceremony, a Friday night ceremony anywhere? And how these rituals and practices have adapted over time to honor that migration is part of our history of humanity. And so I also think about how do we pass along our traditions and rituals in the ways that the grandmother and the child does in your very book, Chanda, and how do we build up a sense of pride and identity for folks who might be struggling with a sense of how come mom and dad do things this way or act that way, and my friends do things this way and that way, and where do I fit in if I'm not from here or there? And I think about community a lot and building resilience. I think about narrative, which is one of the things I love about children's books too, being able to see their experience reflected in another story with beautiful, bright colors, and that is celebration. So I think that none of this is necessarily easy, but there's a lot of beauty that can come to life in this. And I think your book does an excellent job of that.
Thank you both. It is exactly that. I wanted to highlight this. There's something beautiful about being able to continue in preserving your culture. and that we can come to a new place and be able to share what is important to us and feel like we belong as well. And so I really felt such a great connection to, I think, all of your work, really, to be honest. It was just so striking in that all the work that you're doing, it is to ensure that people are receiving not only health benefits, but I think part of health is kind of reinvigorating someone's mental well-being too, and allowing them to truly be themselves. So thank you.
I mean, I think in follow-up to that theme, can you comment a little bit about whether effective mental health care looks different in different cultures, and what we can do to address cultural stigma around mental health treatment, which exists here as it does everywhere else, and how can we promote healing?
Can I direct this to Rahel?
I mean, those are all great. I feel like they're like 3 questions all in one. Like, how do we, and I think we can put them all, together in a lot of ways. So, I mean, I think one is, I think absolutely, I think mental health does look different in different cultures. It really has to be tailored to the context of the culture, right? I think that mental health is really deeply influenced by cultural beliefs, values, societal norms that really shape how we experience, how we understand, and how we address mental health challenges. And so oftentimes when you think about like Western medicine, it often takes this individualistic, biologically driven approach of like diagnosis, come into an inpatient visit, weekly personal therapy. In contrast, I think there's a whole other view of culture, like worldview of mental health in cultures, where it may be seen more through a spiritual lens or more through like a collective experience involving family and community. So I think to offer holistic care, our care must really align with these differences. I think, for example, in a lot of cultures, like in Southeast Asia or the Middle East or Latin American cultures, mental health symptoms are often expressed as physical symptoms like fatigue or headaches or dizziness or, like GI or digestive issues, rather than like emotional problems like I feel sad or I feel anxious or depressed. So, and I think these aren't just merely like linguistic differences. I think they're really culturally rooted in the way that we experience and communicate distress. I remember when I would talk to my family and I'll ask them what's going on, and they're like, they would say something like, my heart is exploding. And I'm like, okay, is that chest pain? Is this, it takes a long time to kind of tease out, understand what that is. And so I think effective care in this context, for example, might begin with addressing their somatic complaints, using that shared language to open discussion about emotional well-being and really the connection between the mind and the body. And it also may involve really collaborating very closely with primary care providers. I think another example that's really relevant in my own experiences also is that a lot of cultures, including the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, see mental health really tied to like spiritual issues and related to like challenges and the imbalance of their faith. And so I think in this context, it's really important to really have some guidance from spiritual leaders or traditional healers. And I think that for example, as mental health providers, then I think incorporating, what is health to them, incorporating meditation practices or prayer or as part of our sessions are really important, or collaborating with faith leaders and faith healers and really asking about that. I remember one time, and this totally freaked me out. This is when I was early in my career. I was doing an intake. I was in primary care, and I was asking about like medical conditions and doing a full like review of systems, and everything was fine. And I don't know I'm so glad. And I'm like, I don't know what it got me to ask this particular patient. I said, well, do you ever see any kind of traditional healers or anyone like that for any kind of issue? And the answer was yes. And then all of a sudden there was all of these things that they in their mind didn't put in the category of illness that needed to be reported to like a doctor, and that out of that came that this person had a tumor in their brain and all of these things, and I was like, oh my gosh, like this could have been a huge miss. And so I think really like having that language of, what is, where do they find, what do they like kind of thinking about, what do they not only understand how they're experiencing something, but what do they think will help them, can really help inform us and help us know how to collaborate with those folks. I think in terms of, maybe I'll pass it to the others around like what promote healing, and then I can add more, so it's just not my only voice like that's going in terms of like what can reduce stigma, promote healing, and then I can maybe say more about that. But Hannah, if you wanted to share a little bit about that first.
Sure. Thank you. I'm reflecting, Rahel, as I hear you speak, and on this question, I'm reflecting on the immense privilege I've had of working with folks from around the world, and how much I've learned from their understanding of what they're experiencing. And I think of culture as, it is part of how we organize and understand our experiences, our interactions, what is happening to us. And so it's part of our meaning-making toolkit, right? Culture is integral to that. And so much of trauma recovery work and healing is about making meaning of our experiences, right? Making meaning of it so that we can then integrate it instead of it remaining this kind of fragmented, split off piece that can take over more control perhaps than we want it to. And narrative, like children's books, is a great example of a meaning-making process. And I think because culture is so indicative of that, it's impossible to kind of separate the two. And I'm trained as a social worker, which means that we're trained to be really person-centered, and start where the person in front of us is at, and kind of ask them what they know about what's going on with them, kind of ask them like how would they describe, what is their language for it? How would they describe the pain? How would they describe the suffering? Where in the body might that live? Where in their heart or their soul might that live? What are the things that they are already doing, right, to help them feel better? Many folks, as Rahel mentioned, turn to spiritual or religious communities. And I also think about, I used to work with folks that would go to a curandero or a healer, right? And some of the healing practices include limpias and pláticas, and these are like cleanings, or pláticas, like a talk, right? But you have your like designated person that is kind of the holder of this wisdom, and we start to see some parallels, right? I think about the history of dance and singing in so many places around the world to pass on traditions and cultures and stories of people. And I think about how dance is a bilateral movement. And, we are learning more and more about how bilateral stimulation can help with trauma reprocessing. I think about the vibrations of vocal cords when it comes to singing, and how that we're learning more about how that kind of calms and soothes the nervous system. So there's these wisdoms that folks have had around the world for ages and ages and generations. And how do we amplify, highlight that, and respect that, and use the language the folks that we're working with are using, right? So that we're not dismissing it, so we're not taking it seriously. In fact, it's central, right? And we're learners often. We're learners as folks let us know what tools they might have so that we can support them in accessing that.
Thank you. Thank you all. I just wanted to chime in from a non-clinical standpoint, but from more of a social and practical standpoint of thinking about intersectionality. So none of us just show up as one identity. We all have multiple identities, whatever they may be, whether it's cultural, linguistic, your religion, and all of these things impact the way that we move through the world. And as such, they impact how you may access care or think about what is health and what is wellness. And so I think it's important to bring all of those identities to the table as practitioners when you're seeing your patients, what that may mean, as human beings interacting with each other, what that may mean, and asking questions. Like you said, Chanda, it's just simple acts of kindness, like maybe just asking somebody, are you doing okay today? that makes a big difference. Maybe they may open up to you. You never know. And so I think it's important, as much as we depend on the Western medicine concepts, that integrating the spiritual and the cultural, even the dietary components, are important as we navigate health for ourselves and to promote the importance of different identities and that they should be celebrated.
I think that's really, it's such a really great point to highlight that, that we all bring different identities, and the intersectionality of all of these things within our clients and our patients and within ourselves as well. There's all of these identities we bring into the room. And I was really struck by, your, Chandra, your comment about small acts of kindness are really what's so profound. And it kind of makes me think of Maya Angelou's quote that, I've learned that people forget what you said, people forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I think it's those kinds of acts of kindness that also help to reduce stigma, and that bring back humanity to people that have struggled so much, overcome so much, and then come into a context where often they're not understood very well, and there's also discrimination there. I guess just really a story that kind of came to my mind as you're sharing that was, there was an immigrant that I've kind of worked with over the years, who was also a survivor of labor trafficking. And he didn't speak a lot of English at the time when he came to the United States. And he shared with us how during his exploitation, he had many encounters with healthcare providers, and they were all filled with bias and judgment and stigma, except for one moment. He talks about how there was a provider that offered him a glass of water. And it wasn't really about the water, it was about the message behind it, I see you, you matter. And it was that kind of small act of kindness that really, that he highlighted as one of the pivotal moments in his own journey through trafficking and through immigration, an otherwise really difficult time.
Chanda, does any of that resonate with your experience and with those around you who've experienced the diaspora from Cambodia?
Yes, I think everything that I think everyone said here is, I feel like the experiences are coming back to life, and just a reminder of all the things that I feel like, it's not one thing, it's many different things. And how do we approach someone who has all of these things that you as a provider may only be learning about for the first time, and help to navigate the healing process, and understanding to ensure that this individual is going to do better and be better. So for my family, we struggled with a lot of different things. I think the genocide itself was PTSD, which I don't think in the late 70s, early 80s was something that people talked about a lot. And also just so the way the war occurred was that close to a quarter of the population had been eradicated. And so many people had lost family members. My father was the only survivor out of 4. And I felt like there was no real discussion around that, other than I think there was survivor's guilt, that, he had survived. And so he felt this, I think in some ways, just guilt. And how do we address that in healthcare? And then, to think about who was killed during the genocide. It was educated people, it was doctors, lawyers, scientists, and the survivors were mostly farmers who were illiterate and who mostly couldn't read and write. So even sharing the story about what occurred was so low, meaning it was, and I wrote this book because after about 40 years of, I think, being here as a first generation, I hadn't found a book that talked about our experience. And so I really wanted to highlight this as part of a healing process. And I think when we're going back to talking about healing, this is exactly that, using a children's book to kind of help educate communities about the people they are coming across and their stories, and how healthcare providers can be a part of this healing process by understanding more about the communities they serve.
Thank you for that. I wanted to pick up on something that Dr. Bosson had mentioned about somatic symptoms. Dr. Bosson has prior experience as an internal medicine doctor before training in psychiatry. So I wanted to ask, are there actual physical health effects, changes in blood pressure, other things that can be seen related to some of the mental health experiences of forced displacement?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of physical effects. Trauma doesn't just stay in the mind. I think it impacts our body significantly. I think people who are displaced often endure chronic stress, exposure to violence, lack of access to basic needs, uncertainty of the future. And all of these things really activate the body's stress response. And when it's prolonged, can lead to really serious physical health issues. I think also there's also restructuring that happens physically in your brain as well, and how your brain functions. But physically, for example, chronic stress can increase levels of cortisol, which is really a hormone in your body that is released, to fight against stress. But over time, having prolonged levels of that can really reduce your immune system. It can lead to cardiovascular disease, chronic conditions like high blood pressure, Fiona, like Dr. Danahar, like you've mentioned, or diabetes. It may also, I think also a lot of folks that are displaced experience sleep disturbances, fatigue. They have a lot of musculoskeletal and physical injuries just as a result of the displacement and the migration. I think it's also worth mentioning that there's also the reality of really unmet healthcare needs, right? Like many forcibly displaced people lose access to medical care, and this can lead to really progression of untreated conditions. So, for example, someone that may have diabetes can start experiencing complications just due to lack of medications, lack of proper nutrition. Even chronic respiratory conditions like asthma can worsen just due to like poor quality air or overcrowded situations or exposures to like hazardous environments. Pregnant women may lack access to prenatal care that increases risk for complications, both for the mother and baby. And there's been research around this, and we've found that research with patients that are like asylum seekers, refugees, have higher rates of chronic diseases like hypertension or diabetes compared to non-immigrant population. I also think trauma does manifest physically in what's known as somatization, where emotional pain kind of presents as physical symptoms, where people might experience chronic headaches, back pain, unexplained aches. And I think there's actually a really great book that I want to kind of plug in here, which really talks about the physical expression of the deeper psychological distress and the connection between how trauma just does not affect our mind, but it really gets trapped in our body. And it's called The Body Keeps Score by Basil. And it's a really powerful book that really talks about the interconnection of mind and body, and how trauma is really also stored up in our body.
Thank you. Given all of the incredible challenges that folks who experience forced displacement face, not just at the time of their displacement, but in terms of their adjustment to life in a new country, and all of the emotional impacts and potentially physical health impacts, it clearly takes a lot of resilience to not just survive, but thrive. And I'm wondering, Chanda and others, what you think people can do to sort of uplift and honor that. Chanda, when people read this book and they see the family in this book, what do you hope they see?
Thank you, Fiona. I hope that people see, the love and family resilience the sharing of different cultures, and how, what might appear different is actually quite similar to many other people's stories. And so I think this book really showcases what the path looks like in kind of modern day immigration process. I feel like sometimes it's just when people feel disconnected, it's harder for people to understand someone else's story. But I think the connection here is that, we likely all know someone who came here as immigrants. And whether it's our grandparents, it's our family and friends, I think there's something to be said about drawing more of a connection than a disconnect, and understanding that, we can learn so much about other people's culture simply by, I think, acknowledging that we all have journeyed here in different ways. And so I think it's just a general respect and an understanding. But I hope that this story gives people a sense of a newer wave of immigrants that came, and a better understanding of that newer wave. And just a little bit of background on the things that was occurring during that time in the 70s, late 60s and early 70s. The Vietnam War was occurring. And the US had a lot of connections to this area at the time. And so this newer wave came to America, but I don't think there was a strong narrative as to the reasons for coming. And so I think this allows people to explore kind of the history behind US and Southeast Asian geopolitical relationships, and really understand that, we as a group, I think have to teach more of this in our schools, in our educational systems, and kind of widen this understanding of what history looks like.
That's such an important point. And it brings me to my last question for you, which is, genocide is a really heavy topic, obviously. And I'm curious why you chose children's literature to convey your message. What do you think children's literature can teach children, and also what can it teach us as adults?
So this is such a wonderful question. I look at this book as an all ages story. Oftentimes children, they do not buy their own books. And the encounter with books, it's usually, at least from my understanding, I have a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old, is either through their classrooms as part of their curriculum or at the library. And so if they're not seeing books like this on their shelves at school or the libraries, they're not seeing it. They're not witnessing it. And so writing it out as a children's book, the reasons for that is to present something in a less complicated way, something much more simplistic, but also engaging an audience, not only the children, but the grandparents and the family members and the parents who buy the books. Because oftentimes they are only learning about this experience for the first time as well. So I think the reasons for starting it out as a children's book is really to break down a story that is complex into something that allows for people to better understand in kind of small steps. And I think the story does just that, in allowing people to kind of think about a genocide that occurred that they may not be aware of, and also classmates and family and friends that they may not, understand the history behind the immigration process, in kind of acknowledging and educating that community, in getting a better sense of the reasons for Cambodian-Americans being present in America.
Thank you so much. Related to that, do you have any particular advice for those present who may be caregivers of children about how you would like to see them talk to children about immigration and cultural differences?
Sure. I feel like books is such an easy way to start, especially a children's book. These topics, generally speaking, I think immigration, migration, and genocide, war, all things are quite complicated sometimes, depending on where you are and where you live. I feel like the community I live in welcomes, I think, immigrants in a different way. And so me talking to my children about their differences and their approach to dealing with some of the, I think sometimes, even for my own family, it's helping them to understand their identity without feeling like they're losing some other part of their identity. So that you can be both, or you can be many, without feeling like you are marginalized. And so I think that's really the way that I look at this book is to show that there's not one way of being, there's many ways of being, and that we can be accepted in those ways and belong in those ways and truly find our own self in that identity and be comfortable with that. And then I'm just reminded that there's only one you. And so, how do you be the best you that you can be? And so I think this story kind of showcases that, in which Pip is talking about kind of this, I think, feeling of shame and embarrassment of who she is through that recipe. But I think she acknowledges at the end that, she's just grateful for her grandmother, I think, being able to survive and coming to a new country and thriving, but to share something with her community and ultimately win a prize.
No, that's really wonderful. And I hope that there are prizes in the future for your book. Thank you so much for being here to share both your story as you wrote it, as well as your own lived experience with us. For those who are attending, as Amy mentioned, this has been recorded and will be available for reference. We do have additional events throughout the week celebrating Migration is Beautiful and the United Nations International Migrants Day. For those who are at MGH, you can find the schedule of events on Vitals. And for those who might be members of the public, we do have another event coming up on Thursday called Suitcase Stories, where we'll get to hear directly from folks who have lived experience of migration and learn more about their stories. So thank you again, everybody, for participating today. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Chanda.
Thank you.